today to do my June wrap up and my July TBR. June ended up being a very slow reading month for me. I only completed 5 books. I'm very close to completing the last one. And it was just very busy, and reading kind of fell to the back burner. I think that the Book Tea Prize reading from the month before pushed some of my reading into June, and then I just didn't have the energy to force myself to read quickly. I just wanted to read at a more leisurely pace, and so that's what I did. So I completed Halfbreed by Maria Campbell. This was an autobiography of Maria's life. Mostly her childhood. I would say a huge part of the book is her childhood. She is a Métis woman, born in Saskatchewan, lived in British Columbia and in Alberta. She had a very difficult life living as what she would have called half-breed at the time, but what we now refer to in Canada as Métis. So that means a Indigenous and settler combination, usually French, Canadian, and Indigenous descendants. And they have a very unique culture within Canada that makes them not really feel like they fit in with white settler Canadians, and not really fit in with Indigenous Canadians. So there's this very tumultuous life that kind of on the margins that Maria and her family lived, and her community lived. And she went through a lot of poverty and trauma, and reinvented herself many times. And she is a survivor. It's a story of survival. It's a story of perseverance. It's a story of the importance of family. And it really was very eye-opening to me. Showed me a lot of things about how marginalization is so ingrained in our culture, and how important it is to remove those barriers that a lot of white Canadians don't even really understand are there. Maria Campbell went on to be a very accomplished playwright and activist, and so this book doesn't really cover any of that part of her life. It kind of covers the beginnings of her becoming active and an activist in the Métis community, and in the broader Canadian political society, but it's really a small portion at the end. The book really covers her childhood. So I'm glad I read it. I think it was a really enriching book, and I will probably talk more about it in my 1970s lit video when we get to that down the road this year. I also read Daybook, The Journal of an Artist by Anne Truitt. This I read alongside a few members of the Artist Mother Network, and this book is a diary written over the course of a year during the 1970s. And I really enjoyed listening to Anne Truitt's reflections on motherhood and being an artist. And especially because, this is a woman from a generation that would be the same generation as my grandmother. So 2 generations removed from my life, and how poignant her observations were, and how interesting it is that so many of the things she struggled with are still going on today, are still things that, I struggle with today. She also, I thought, showed a really well-rounded person who had these struggles with being a mother and with being an artist, and how they kind of contradict each other, how they challenge each other, those identities. And also, just the day-to-day of trying to pay the bills when you are living off your art. So a lot of really interesting observations. And Truitt definitely came from a place of privilege. So, I think that her story has to be read through that lens in a lot of ways. But, there's a lot in here. I will probably reread this sometime in the future, especially because she reflects on the transition in motherhood to parenting adult children, and how she considered it to be this kind of second birth of your children when they birth away from you. So, a lot of really interesting observations around that. I read Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was extremely compelling. I liked every single section. The story is told through the generations of descendants of half-sisters from Ghana, and it alternates between the two perspectives, and it just flowed beautifully. I didn't find there was any parts that were boring. I didn't think that I wasn't disinterested in anyone's story. I cared about all of them and wanted them all to do well and to succeed in life. And there's just so many parts of the history of Ghana and the history of the US that are shared throughout the book, and I just think it was written in just a wonderfully compelling way. It was just always wanting to learn the next thing and wanting to connect this story of these disparate family members, and I enjoyed the ending, and I would really recommend that story. I think it's worth the hype that it gets. On audio this month, I listened to The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai, and at this moment, this book is my top book of 2021. I just loved it. I loved all of the characters in the book. I loved the perspective shifts. So we have 1986 Chicago, Boys Town, height of the AIDS epidemic, and the ravishing of the community of men who are trying to grapple with this disease but are not getting enough support from government or hospitals or their families in a lot of cases. So they form families and try to take care of each other, but it's just this horrible spiral of death and loss and pain. But also within it, beautiful relationships and people who care about each other and people who, push each other to do wonderful things. So this wonderful story. And in the 1986 segment, there's also a lot of art, because Yale, our main character, is an acquisition person for the University Art Gallery, and so he's going and trying to get this art for the Art Gallery's collection. And so there's a lot of really fun behind the scenes references to how that process would happen. Then there's also kind of a multi-generational story involving an artist slash elderly woman who is donating some art, and so you hear a bit about her story in Paris. And then you go forward into 2015 and you meet up with some of these characters in a future setting. And you see Fiona, who was in the 1986 section, but also is the main person in the 2015 section, how she's grappling with everything that happened to her in that time period. And she's carried it with her for all this time. And she's dealing with it throughout her time in Paris in 2015. And, I cared about all the characters. I wanted them all to do well. I just got wrapped right up in the story, and I think it was just beautifully executed. There were, horrible realities that were brought to light, that are important for people who may have been alive at that time but weren't participating in this aspect of society, and who don't know, such as myself, how alone so many people felt as they were going through this terrible ordeal, and as it still continues to perpetuate today, even though it's changed so much with the advances in medicines for HIV positive and AIDS patients. It's still something that is a current event, and it still should be, at the forefront of people's minds when they're considering health and access and equality and all those things. So just such a beautiful book. I listened to a few reviews where people didn't think it was successful. I don't agree. I think it was a really successful novel. So glad I finally got to read it. Delightful, and just such a. I mean, I could have kept reading about those characters infinitely, basically. So that's how much I liked it. And then my last read for June, going into the little beginning of July, is Belonging and Culture of Place by Bell Hooks. This is an essay collection. She says at the beginning that some of it is repetitive because when she wrote these essays, she wasn't necessarily writing them for a collection. They were for different things. And so when you put them together, there's a little bit of repetition. But I don't think it's too much. The essays I've enjoyed the most so far are her essays about her grandmother, who was a quilter, and about Black women's contribution to art and craft and legacy. Bell Hooks grows up in Kentucky, goes away to university, lives away for, I think, several decades, and then moves back to Kentucky. And she has a really interesting perspective that I think a lot of people could benefit from reading, and that is a rural perspective. She talks a lot about Wendell Berry. I believe there is an interview in one of the essays here that I'm going to get to soon with Wendell Berry, who I know is quite a beloved author, also from Kentucky, and also writing about issues of rural versus urban and how there's this kind of elitism around being from an urban place. Having grown up in the country, having lived rurally for my childhood until I was 17, I totally got a lot of what she was saying, but obviously the perspective that she's coming from as a descendant of Black farmers in Kentucky and previous slaves in former generations is very different from mine as a white settler colonial background. But I think that there's a lot to be said for the importance of understanding rural life, rural living, and the benefits of being connected to the land. And she also talks a lot about the Kentucky Hills and how there was this irreverence for proper living and people who are living like on their own terms and with a certain level of freedom in those hills, and how that is looked down upon and why that is looked down upon within white supremacist patriarchy. So, a lot in here, a lot to digest, a lot of really good observations and intersectional theories that she brings up. So, it's been a really great read. Okay, I'm going to try to really quickly go through my TBR for July. I'm hoping I'm going to have a bit more time to read in July. I am going to be listening to Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen for Jane Austen July. Last year I listened to Pride and Prejudice, really enjoyed it. I find I do better with classics on audio because they just move a bit faster for me, and I can kind of zone out a bit if I find that it's going in a direction that's a bit boring, and check back in when it's not so boring. I hope that doesn't sound weird, but that's just what I found worked better for me in the last few times I've read classics. So I love the film Sense and Sensibility, starring Emma Thompson and Kate Winslet. Is one of my favorite films of all time. And so I don't want the book to disappoint me because I really, really love it so much. I love the story so much. So we'll see how that goes. But that's going to be my Jane Austen July read. I was craving some poetry this month, and so I chose The Pemmican Eaters, poems by Marilyn Dumont. Marilyn Dumont is also a Métis woman, and so I thought it would be great to read another perspective, another Métis perspective this month. And these poems sound absolutely fascinating. She took the term the Pemmican Eaters from something that the first Prime Minister of Canada, John A. Macdonald, called Métis people. He called them the Pemmican Eaters, obviously in a derogatory way. And so she's kind of reclaiming that term, and these poems explore so many aspects of colonial history, and there's even a specific language, the Michif language, that she incorporates into the poem. So really interested in reading more about this and learning more about Métis culture. The next book I'm going to be reading is The Land We Are, Artists and Writers Unsettle the Politics of Reconciliation, edited by Gabrielle, Hill, and Sophie McCall. And this is kind of an art book, essays, poetry mixed in. There's a whole bunch of contributors to it. And what it is exploring the idea of reconciliation, which is something that Canada is supposed to be engaging in with Indigenous peoples of this land, and which is not really happening in a positive or in a way that is being honoring the legacy of colonial settler history. And so this is some art that I think will be very insightful and helpful for me in grappling with a lot of those feelings that I've certainly been grappling with for the last month, as more and more grave sites, unmarked grave sites, are being revealed around the residential school system that Canadians were imposing upon Indigenous peoples for decades. And so this is just more of my own education, but also learning about artists who are tackling these issues through art. I'm going to be doing 2 read-alongs this month. The first one is the final book in the Patternmaster series by Octavia E. Butler, and the final book is Patternmaster. So I did not read the last book in the read-along, which was Survivor, because it was a bit hard to get, and I also knew that I would be reading for the BookTube Prize and I wouldn't really have time to join in on the read-alongs. So I will be joining in on the read-alongs for this one, and this will be my final book in the Octavia Butler slow read. I do plan to read more of her work in future, but I'm not going to be reading any more in the read-along schedule for the rest of, I think it ends in fall of 2022, so there's a lot more books left to read, but this will be my last one. I'm very excited to wrap up this series and read the last book. And then A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James. This book is on my 5-star predictions list, so I was planning to read it this month. And then I found out that Melanated Reader, which is a Bookstagram account, and I believe she also has a book blog, is hosting a read-along during the month of July. So I'm already behind on it, but I'm going to try to catch up, and I'm going to try to follow along as best I can. And you can find, I will put her Instagram handle down below so that you can look it up if you're interested in joining in. And this book is a fictional interpretation of the shooting of Bob Marley in Jamaica in 1976. One of my top reads of 2020 was The Night Women by Marlon James. I loved it so much. And so this book won the Booker Prize in 2015, and I really admire Marlon James's writing. So I hope that I love this one as much as I loved the Book of Night Women. And I'm really excited to be able to read along with a whole group of people who are also reading it. So that'll be my other group read along for 2021 July. And the other book that I'm reading right now is The Labyrinth by Amanda Lohrey. This book is one of the shortlisted books for the Miles Franklin Award, I believe. It was just read by Natalie from Natalie Marie's channel, and she really loved it, and we have very similar taste in reading, so I was excited because it's called The Labyrinth. It's about a woman who follows her son who is in prison and buys a home in a very rural part of Australia, and she gets this urge to build a labyrinth. And I thought, because I've been doing research on labyrinths, I thought that that would be a perfect fiction book to add to my labyrinth list. So I'm very excited about that. Hopefully get some inspiration for my labyrinth journal sketchbook. And that's what I'm going to be reading for the month of July. I may end up adding some more poetry in there if I get a chance, but if I get through all of these, I'm going to be really happy with myself. So I hope you had a good reading month in June and that you are reading some great books in July. I'd love to hear what books you are reading for this month, or maybe one of the ones that you're most excited about reading. And I will try to be back again very soon with another video. Thank you so much for watching.